Remember that crazy election back in 2000 with the whole hanging Chad thing in Florida? Oh, get this. That wasn't just about like old voting machines or whatever.
Yeah.
That election, it actually led to one of the most controversial Supreme Court cases ever, Bush v. Gore. And you want to know the really crazy part? People are still arguing about it today like it just happened.
It really is wild how one case can still have people talking all these years later. Just picture it, okay? A presidential election so close that it comes down to just a handful of votes in one single state. That was Florida back in 2000. And that Supreme Court decision, Bush v. Gore, it still has a huge impact on how we vote even today.
So today, we're taking a deep dive into this super important case. We've got excerpts from the actual Supreme Court judgment, the majority opinion, the concurrences. We've even got those really intense dissents. It's like we're right there in the courtroom. What's so interesting about this deep dive, though, is that we're not just hearing one side of the story, you know? We're getting the full picture, the complete 360.
That's right. We're diving into a case that tackled these huge, massive questions. We're talking the balance of power between states and the federal government when it comes to elections. What fairness really means when each and every vote is so important. I mean, these are some really big questions that get right to the heart of how our democracy works.
All right, so before we get too deep into the legal arguments and all that, paint a picture for us of what was happening in Florida back then. It was a real nail-biter, right?
Totally, yeah. Bush and Gore, they were separated by just a tiny, tiny number of votes. I mean, really, really close. And of course, that triggered an automatic recount with machines. But even after the machines did their thing, spit out the numbers, the gap between Bush and Gore was still crazy small. And that's when people started demanding manual recounts, especially from certain counties in Florida. That's when things got really interesting.
Okay, hold on a second. Before we get to the recounts, let's make sure everyone listening understands what we're talking about here. What's the big deal with a manual recount? Just like double checking the math, right?
Well, you'd think it'd be that simple, right? But it gets way more complicated than that. You see, a machine recount, that's pretty simple. It's like when you take one of those Scantron tests. The machine just looks at it and spits out the answer. Easy peasy. But a manual recount, now you've got actual people trying to figure out what the voter meant to do, what their intention was. And let's be honest, sometimes those ballots, well, they aren't exactly crystal clear.
Gotcha. So we've got this super tight race, people demanding manual recounts left and right, and tensions are running high. And this is when the Supreme Court jumps into the middle of everything. Suddenly, everything's even more intense.
You got it. The Supreme Court, by a 5-4 vote, put a stop to the Florida recount. And basically that handed the win to Bush. But, and this is really important, the justices themselves were really divided on the legal reasoning for stopping the recount. It sparked this whole fascinating debate.
And that's what's so interesting about this case, right? It's not just about who became president in the end. This case, it really showed these deep, deep cracks in how we understand, like, the very foundation of our democracy.
You said it. This case went way beyond just counting votes. It was about how we should interpret the Constitution itself. And one of the big questions the justices wrestled with was whether the Florida Supreme Court had gone too far by ordering a recount in the first place. Like, had they overstepped their boundaries? Was this a classic case of what we call judicial overreach, where a court tries to act like the legislature and make laws? Or was the Florida Supreme Court just trying to make sure that every single vote was actually counted?
And then there's that whole thing about the Equal Protection Clause, right? That feels like a major player in this whole legal battle.
Oh, absolutely. This idea that everyone's vote should carry the same weight, that's where the Equal Protection Clause comes in. It's basically the Constitution's way of saying, hey, no fair-picking favorites in an election. The justices, they were really struggling with this question of whether the different ways of counting votes in different Florida counties, remember, there were those inconsistencies. Whether those differences violated the Equal Protection Clause. Was everyone's vote really being treated equally? And if not, what did that mean for the election itself? Did it mean the election wasn't legitimate?
It's almost like the presidency itself made things even more complicated. Like everyone was saying, whoa, hold on, we're talking about the president here. It's different. It's like that one office, the presidency, it's just way more important than any other elected position we have.
You've hit on a really key point there. Chief Justice Rehnquist, in his opinion, he zeroed in on that idea, that a presidential election, it's in a whole different category from all the other elections we have. So now we're left with this question: does the presidency really have this special status? And does that make it more open to these kinds of legal challenges, more vulnerable? Or does it actually make it harder for people to challenge a presidential election?
Which I'm guessing not everyone on the court was on board with that idea, right?
Let's just say not everyone was thrilled about it. Justice Stevens, in his dissent, he basically dropped a legal truth bomb. He flat out said that the majority's decision wasn't just legally wrong. He argued that it actually damaged the public's trust in the judiciary itself. Just think about that for a second. A Supreme Court justice saying that his own court's decision might make people lose faith in the entire judicial system.
Wow, talk about speaking your mind, right? So we've got a sense of the legal arguments, the big constitutional questions at play. But did any of the justices say anything in their opinions that really stands out? Anything that gives us a peek behind the curtain, so to speak?
Oh, yeah, Justice Stevens, he didn't hold back, that's for sure.
Yeah.
He even wrote this, listen to this, he said, although we may never know with complete certainty the identity of the winner of this year's presidential election, the identity of the loser is perfectly clear. It is the nation's confidence in the judge as an impartial guardian of the rule of law. Powerful stuff.
Wow. He's basically saying that the court's decision, it actually hurt more than it helped, even if it technically followed the law. It really makes you think about the impact these huge legal decisions have on everyday people.
It does. And it shows just how much power the Supreme Court has. I mean, they're not just interpreting the law, they're shaping how the public sees justice itself, you know.
It's kind of mind-blowing when you think about how one court case back in 2000 can still feel so relevant today. When you look at what's happening now in 2024, it feels like we're still dealing with the fallout from Bush v. Gore.
You're not wrong. All these debates about voting rights, election integrity, the role of the courts, they're more heated than ever. In that case, Bush v. Gore, it was like someone shone a giant spotlight on the weak points in how we run elections. And those problems haven't magically disappeared. If anything, they've become even more intense.
And we're not just talking about hypotheticals here, right? This case had real, tangible consequences.
100%. Think about it. Bush v. Gore, it set off this wave of changes to election laws all over the country. Lots of them were aimed at making voting technology and procedures more uniform, so everyone's on the same page. But even with all those changes, we're still wrestling with the same old problems. Arguments over voter ID laws, whether everyone has equal access to polling places, even the design of the ballots themselves can be an issue. It all comes down to fairness and making sure everyone has an equal opportunity to vote. It's like those echoes we were talking about, those echoes of those same debates we had back in 2000.
So how do we fix this? What can we learn from Bush v. Gore to make sure our elections are fair and trustworthy?
That's the million-dollar question, right? But one thing's for sure. We need our election laws to be clear and consistent. Bush v. Gore showed us what a disaster it can be when the rules are vague, especially when we're talking about something as fundamental as counting votes.
It's like everybody took a step back after 2000 and said, okay, hold up. We need clear rules for everyone.
That's it. And those rules can't just be clear. They need to be applied the same way everywhere, for everyone. It doesn't matter which party someone belongs to or which candidate they support. The rules are the rules.
Because at the end of the day, this is about something much bigger than any single election or any one candidate. It's about protecting our democracy, making sure it's strong and healthy.
You said it. And that responsibility, it doesn't just fall on the shoulders of lawmakers and judges. It's on all of us. Each and every one of us needs to be informed and engaged citizens. We need to demand transparency and accountability in our elections.
So as we head into the 2024 election, what does all this mean for the people listening? What's the takeaway from this deep dive into a case that, at first glance might seem like ancient history?
Bush v. Gore, it's a powerful reminder that our democracy is always a work in progress. It's constantly changing and growing, and it's always vulnerable to being challenged. This case shows us just how important it is for all of us to be involved, to think critically about these issues, and to commit to making sure our elections are fair and equal for everyone.
It reminds us that our votes matter, and so do the systems we use to count them. But it's not all doom and gloom, is it? We can do things as individuals and as a society to create a stronger, more resilient democracy.
Yeah, for sure. It's more about, recognizing where the system is kind of shaky and then actually doing something about it,
So where do we even start? What can people listening do to actually make a difference?
I'd say one of the biggest things is just to be informed, to actually know what's going on. You got to understand the election laws in your own state, know what your rights are as a voter, and keep up with any changes or challenges to how we run elections.
It's true what they say, right? Knowledge is power. The more we understand how things work, the better we can spot problems and push for solutions.
Exactly. And don't think for a second that your voice doesn't matter.
Yeah.
Talk to your friends and family about this stuff. Call your elected officials, make some noise.
It's like that saying, the price of freedom is eternal vigilance.
Yeah.
We can't just assume our democracy is going to take care of itself. We have to actually participate to protect it and make it stronger.
You got it. And part of that means being willing to have real conversations with people who see things differently than you.
Yeah.
We're not always going to agree, but listening to each other is so important if we're going to find common ground and make our democracy more resilient, less fragile.
Because really, a healthy democracy, it needs people to have these open, honest debates and be committed to those core principles of fairness and equality. It goes way beyond just one party or one election. It's so much bigger than any of us.
Couldn't agree more. And that's what makes these conversations so important, especially now with another election coming up that's probably going to be pretty intense.
We've covered a ton of ground today. We started with hanging chads and recounts, and somehow ended up talking about the Constitution and what fairness really means when it comes to elections. It's a lot to take in, for sure, but hopefully this deep dive got you thinking in new ways and maybe even feeling a little more, I don't know, a little more responsibility when it comes to being a citizen.
Totally. And remember, this isn't about telling you what to think. It's about getting you to ask the tough questions, to think for yourself, and to be part of this conversation about what our democracy should look like in the future.
Because the story of Bush v. Gore, it's not over. We're still writing it, all of us. If you're feeling curious, if something we talked about today really piqued your interest, don't stop here. Go learn more about the stuff we discussed, look up your local election laws, and most importantly, get involved. Your voice matters. Your vote matters. You matter. Until next time, keep those brains working and don't be afraid to ask those hard questions.